A recent convert to Christianity was questioned by an unbelieving friend. "So you've been converted to Christ?" "Yes." "Then you must know a great deal about him. Tell me, what country was he born in?" "I don't know." What was his age when he died?" "I don't know." "How many sermons did he preach?" "I don't know that either." "You certainly know very little for a man who claims to be converted to Christ." "You're right," he said. "I am ashamed at how little I know about him. But this much I do know. 3 years ago I was a drunkard. I was in debt. My family had fallen to pieces. My wife and children would dread my return home every evening. But now I've given up drink. We're out of debt. Ours is now a happy home. All this Christ did for me. This much I know of him." The convert knew few facts about Jesus in his life, but what he did know was that Jesus had made such a difference to that life that he was a completely changed man. And knowing Jesus is very different from knowing things about Jesus. Now, one group we might assume who really knew Jesus was his disciples, who shared his life, his ministry, and everything with him. It would have been hard to be so intimately involved with Jesus and not know him. However, it would seem that I may be wrong about this, because though Jesus taught them that he would suffer and die and then be raised up on the third day, the resurrection, when it happened, seemed to come as a complete surprise. And after Jesus was arrested, the disciples went to ground. Their charismatic leader had been crucified, and the great adventure that they'd been involved in for 3 years suddenly came to an abrupt end. And at that end, they failed him spectacularly. Perhaps their belief had been shaken to the core. He hadn't lived up to their expectations of being invincible, and for all his brave talk and daring challenges to the authority of church and state, he had seemingly been defeated by both. He didn't fight his way out of Gethsemane, and at his end, when it came, was filled with pathos. Broken by torture and ridicule, he was dragged up Calvary Hill to die a criminal's death, nailed to a Roman instrument of destruction. And that might have been part of their sadness and disappointment. But also there may have been a feeling that they'd been duped by him. The adventure and the promise of being part of something different, a new kind of living, had crumbled into the dust of Golgotha. But surely they had listened to his teaching and heard him speak of his death as the gateway to new life. Peter had confessed that Jesus was the Christ, the long-expected Messiah. James and John tried to negotiate the top place at the table in heaven. Crazy Thomas decided that he would follow Jesus to Jerusalem and die with him. Yet, when it all went pear-shaped, they showed a remarkable lack of bravery, loyalty, or understanding. And I sometimes think that Jesus had a complete failure in judgment when he chose that lot to be his disciples. They were so obtuse and so thick. Thank goodness he's got it right now with me and you. And also choosing those wonderful women. And they may not have fully understood what was going on, but that didn't send them scurrying up for cover. They loved Jesus. They cared what happened to him. at his death and afterwards. So we find them in the gospel this morning as dawn is breaking on that first Easter morning, going to the tomb with spices and funeral oil. Grief-stricken, this was to be their final act of love for one who had loved them so greatly. What they found when they got there absolutely stunned them. The great stone had been rolled away, and when they entered the tomb, there was nobody there. And they were seeing two men in dazzling clothes, the Bible's way of describing angels. These messengers of God then delivered the proclamation of the resurrection. The women were to stop looking for him, stop looking for the living among the dead. He's not here, they said. He is risen. The angels then reminded them of what Jesus himself had told them, that the Son of Man would be handed over to sinners, crucified, and on the third day rise again. And the penny dropped. This is what Jesus had said about himself. At last, at that moment, they came to know Jesus. But wait until they told those other disciples. Come off it, they said, you're just spreading an idle tale. We simply don't believe you. Even Peter had to go himself. And what he found when the women, exactly as the women had told him, left him amazed. He wasn't expecting the resurrection either. It was a case of what the poet T.S. Eliot says, they had the experience, but they missed the meaning. But then, in the light of what happened that first Easter morning, the meaning came clear. So in today's New Testament reading, we find Peter in the house of Cornelius, responding to a vision that Cornelius had had from God. And there he was, telling the gospel story with conviction and enthusiasm. And that was found in all the apostles and other followers who were emboldened and empowered by the Spirit to proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord and God, risen from the dead, whose resurrection gives a completely new meaning to all our lives. We have the meaning of our resurrection handed on to us from generation to generation, which for the believer means our Lord rising from the dead is an incontestable fact of faith. But to reverse T.S. Eliot's poem, does having the meaning lead you to having the experience? The resurrection is not one of those happy ever after endings which turn some wicked deed on its head and shows the triumph of good, the fairy tale ending that God did some magic trick to turn Black Friday into Golden Sunday. We call the Friday Jesus died Good Friday because the crucifixion doesn't need something to reverse it. The cross is the victory. The cross is God's triumph of love over everything in our world which is not love, over sin, over death, over pride, over power, over selfishness, over oppression, over prejudice. And not forgetting the defeat of the demonic. This victory stands alone. It doesn't need anything to vindicate it or somehow something to reverse its negativity. When Jesus cried, "It is finished, it is accomplished," that was the triumphal shout of victory from the cross. What a joy there must have been in heaven when Jesus made that great cry of triumph. And it's when we see and experience the cross as God's total victory of love that we find it to be the gateway leading us from a sinful life to a totally redeemed life. Because of the cross, we have access to the deliverance which if we accept it, changes us utterly. like the convert in my story. Yet, far too often, resurrection is seen as the reward if we get to heaven and we've been good. If we collect enough points on the way, we might be able to exchange them for a place in heaven. Rather like the man who died and was met by St. Peter at the pearly gates, to be told that to get into heaven, he had to tell St. Peter the good things that he'd done. And St. Peter would then allocate points for each one of them, and he had to get 100 points to get into heaven. So the man told him immediately he'd been married to the same wife for 50 years and he'd never cheated on her. Wonderful, says St. Peter. I'll give you 3 points for that. The man mentioned his church going and his Christian service. Oh, that's another point, says St. Peter. What about the shelter I set up for the homeless and the soup kitchen that I ran? Whoa, definitely worth 2 points, said Peter. 2 points, shouted the man. At this rate, the only way I'm going to get into heaven is by the grace of God. Come right in, said Peter. Only grace, only God's gift of free love, the gift of himself, will get us into heaven. And that is what God's gift is to us. We can never earn it. And whilst the resurrection tells us something of life beyond death, that is far from being the whole story. Resurrection is a natural consequence of the victory of the cross, and it's an invitation to live a completely different sort of life here and now. It's about living our lives to their full potential, to become the kind of person that God longs us to be, the kind of person that he made us in his own image. And the more we become remade in God's image, the closer we get to him. Now, not in the future. You sometimes hear of people who've had a near-death experience, who've experienced the travelling towards a bright light. What is sadly too often the case is that many people have a near-life experience. We don't live our lives to their full potential. We live them in the shadows rather than in the light which is Christ. But it needn't be so. Christ's victory on the cross opens to us this new way of living. The resurrection shows us what that way is. Jesus is doing something radically different when he offers us a share in his risen life. Before Easter Day, it just wasn't possible, which is why it was probably hard for the disciples to understand exactly what Jesus meant by it. Jesus is offering this brand new way of living now. We are all being invited to live life without the limitations that we and others put on it. We are being invited to live a fuller, richer, more true life. To live this risen life means to widen our vision. We are no longer earthbound people. We are actually bound for glory. Because we're actually quite amazing people. So amazing that Christ died for us. So amazing that he really believes in us and in our potential to be truly children of God. What a wonderful thought that is. But it should be more than just a thought. It should be a reality. And it can become real if we heed what the angel said at the tomb. Stop looking for Jesus among the dead. He's not there. He's risen. On Friday morning, we had a children's Way of the Cross service here, and it ended, of course, with Jesus' resurrection. And Jeff standing over there, who kindly reprised his role as Jesus, he's like Jesus in many ways, he very kindly disappeared into the choir stalls and hid at the tomb. And so the children had to start looking for him. And we kept pointing to different parts of the church where Jesus might be. And eventually Jeff appeared from over there, looking risen and very healthy. And as we carried on talking about it, the junior theologians amongst us, the little children, all came to the conclusion that if Jesus isn't just where Jeff was, but he's actually inside us. He's everywhere. He's near us. He's there. He's always with us. He's wherever we are. Because wherever we are, Jesus is active in his life when God's love is working for us. He's there because that's what the resurrection tells us. Jesus is in each one of you, and when you leave this church, you're walking with the risen Lord into the streets of Epping. At the cathedral service on Maundy Thursday, Bishop Stephen told us that he'd been visiting some children in a local school. And he asked questions, and he got the usual kind of questions, why do you wear a silly hat, and why do you do this and that, the other. And then he was suddenly pulled up sharp. A little girl about 7 said, "How much do you love God?" He was tempted to say, "Not enough." But what he actually said was, "Not as much as God loves me." The crucifixion, the resurrection of Jesus, the risen life we live, the real message of Easter is all about that answer. God is with us in Jesus, God is in us, and it's all about how much God loves us. And when we experience that love for ourselves, when we recognize that Jesus is giving us that love always, when we know that he is loving us from the inside, in our hearts, in our souls, in our lives, then it really, really, really is Easter. Jesus Christ is risen. He is alive in us. Happy Easter.